Hey everybody, welcome to today's Laurie Live. Thanks for joining me. This is very exciting to have you all here on this lovely Thursday. Please feel free to turn your cameras on if you want. I love to say hi. And if you want to kind of drop in the comments there where you're tuning in from, that's also super fun. I'm in Vermont and fall is definitely hitting, and it's really lovely to kind of see all the leaves finally taking their last turns before they all fall off, and then it's cold and dark forever. So Santa Maria, California, Santa Barbara County Animal Services. I love that. You guys probably don't have as many leaves changing over in California, Maryland, Toronto. Yeah, Vermont this time of year is lovely. Thank you. I also have never been to Toronto, but I hear it's also really lovely this time of year. Nantucket. Ooh, never been to Nantucket. Been to Cape Cod a couple times. Thank you for joining. I'm so excited to see you all here. Definitely have a lot to chat about today, so I'll get started pretty quickly. I will let you guys know I was at a shelter this morning doing a lot of dog walking and doing some behavior modification, so I'm a little tired today, more so than normal. West Virginia. So I'm going to be in Virginia soon. I know that's not West Virginia, but I'm going to be at the APDT conference in about 2 weeks from now. So if you're going to the APDT conference, please feel free to come by the booth. I'm going to be sharing a table with John from Humane Innovations. He's my new friend that our philosophies align very well, and he provides safe handling gear for animal shelter caretakers. So it's working out pretty well as we're doing stuff together. Yay, Everett, you'll be at APDT. That's great. Salt Lake City in the house, another place I want to go to. One day I feel like I'll get to travel to visit all of you. But all right, so two behavior assessments, because that's I think why we're here today. If this is your first if this is your first time joining live, thank you so much for taking the time to stop by. My name is Laurie Lawless. I am the founder and owner of Shelter Behavior Integrations, and my whole goal is to help bridge the gaps between shelter operations and animal behavior. Because I have found in my career working in many shelters that our departments are very siloed, and as we know, behavior is happening all the time, and everybody plays a piece in an animal's journey through the shelter, and so it's important that we start working on collaborating more effectively and efficiently together. So that's what I like to do, and what I'm going to be talking about today is behavior assessments. So if you were able to join myself and Sue Sternberg a few weeks ago, we had some really interesting and awesome conversations about the changes in animal welfare since Sue Sternberg began, which of course was in the 80s, to where we are now. And we do know that initially, especially in the late 90s, 2000s, and even into when I was getting into animal shelters in about 2010, there were a lot of shelters still performing very standardized behavior assessments. We have since rolled back quite a bit of that because we know that it is very dependent on handler skill, knowledge of animal behavior, and what gets documented. We also know that there is a large possibility of false negatives and false positives on some of the behaviors. So I feel in general, based on what I've been seeing over the last few years that I've really been going out to different shelters, is that we're kind of left in this limbo land of, well, we're not really doing as many standardized assessments, but what are we actually assessing? How do we assess behavior? How do we perform risk assessment, etc.? So I thought that this would be a fun topic today. It's one I've talked in the past, probably about a year, talked about in the past, probably about a year ago, but I thought it's always good to kind of circle back because even in a year, we're always learning so much more. So the first thing that I kind of wanted to discuss was when we're thinking about, and I think it's important to differentiate between, I'll start there, between evaluations and an assessment. So for me, an assessment is something that we're looking at very specifically. So we are looking at getting contextual information about an animal's behavior in a very specific circumstance, with all of the things that are happening and going on in the environment at that time, and documenting the dog's reactions or interactions to both the environment and with us, or maybe if we're doing an assessment with another dog. When I'm looking at doing like the way that I differentiate that from an evaluation is when I'm evaluating a dog, I'm looking at kind of the full picture of who this dog is. So I'm going to take information from individual assessment pieces, and then I'm going to pull in a bunch of other data to make that overall kind of like more holistic view of an evaluation of this dog, who they are, uh, their prognosis, their overall risk, potentially for community safety. And so that's what I like to differentiate those two because I think sometimes those two words get thrown around interchangeably. And I've even become more thoughtful about when I'm using those terms. So today I want to focus mostly on the assessment pieces, which is where we are looking at specific behavior in context and then how we can take all the other data and information and put that into an overall evaluation. So I think when we are going into doing assessments, right, something that we want to make sure that we have going into that is a goal of why we are conducting the assessment itself. So, if we have a dog who has come in with background information, those are all pieces of a puzzle that we want to include in that dog's entire evaluation. But let's say, for example, we have a dog that we have very little information about. That is usually when I'm doing more assessment sections or types or pieces of an assessment because we want to gather some information so we can establish a baseline. And I think it's very important to understand that when we're doing assessments, it is mostly to gather data for a baseline because as that animal gets into the shelter and is going through our daily care operations and we are kind of trying to figure out who they are, it gives us something to work off of. Instead of just a total blank slate. The other thing, so that's one goal, is like establishing behavioral baseline, especially for dogs that we have no data about whatsoever. So like picture your dog that was tied up to the fence when you came in or is dropped off overnight by animal control, or maybe it's a community surrender, but it came from like a third party. We're dealing with a lot of that in Vermont right now with housing issues, and we might have the local community center that's helping someone find housing and they can't keep their dog and it's a little messy and we don't quite get all the bits and pieces. So those are the dogs that I generally would like to take out and get some information about their social behavior towards a person or me. Ideally you're a novel person that hasn't really interacted much with the dog previously. We might want to get an idea of how they respond around other animals. We might want to get an understanding of their handling sensitivities or not. We might want to know how they interact with people and other dogs around them, and obviously taking into account the shelter setting. So when we're looking at doing these specific types of these structured, and it doesn't actually need to necessarily be structured. Like, for example, if I am going to do an assessment of a dog, I'm probably going to start with them in a smaller space. Ideally, it's not in the kennel. Ideally, it's somewhere sort of quiet in the shelter or maybe out to a smaller yard. And I'm just going to kind of get to know the dog a little bit, build some rapport, see if they approach me for petting. I might pick up a toy and see if they're interested in interacting. Will they take food from me? And then once the dog's a little more comfortable, I might go ahead and see if they are okay with different parts of their body being touched, or, if I'm thinking about handling like how they are with like leashing and unleashing, reaching over to put like a harness on, etc. So all of those things cover a lot of the social aspects towards people, toys, if they're interested in toys, if there's any sort of potential resource guarding with the toys, food, how they respond to taking food, what kinds of foods they'll eat, maybe they won't, etc. So we're just using that to kind of gather that type of information. Also important to note in that, for if we're looking for handling specific information from the intake team for in the medical is super important. Those, if we are working on integrating a holistic looking assessment pieces that then build out a full evaluation or picture of the dog. It's really helpful to have those notes from the vet techs. Now, of course, or the veterinarian, right, who's doing those intake medical exams, vaccinations, etc. But of course, they're busy, right? Every department is always busy all the time. And so it can be at something as simple as in your Pet Point or Shelter Love account when they're doing their intake evaluation, we just add in a little box that says, FAS score, right? Fear, anxiety, stress score, if the dog needed any special considerations, etc. For even busier shelters, sometimes I advocate to just put in some drop boxes. It really depends. And that way, even if we can't get a full summary of the dog's behavior because everybody's busy, we can get a little bit of a snapshot piece. So again, uh, we're assessing the dog in the context of a medical exam, which is stressful, which is when the first dog comes in, right? So it gives us a really good idea of how that animal is operating under stress right from the intake door, and we can get that information. So this is especially important for dogs we have no information when they're walking in. And then, like I said, we might go into doing some hands-on stuff where we're taking the dog out to a yard and trying a few different things, seeing what they respond to in the environment. And then I always like to, when I'm doing these things, document other things going on in the environment. So if there's a dog that's very loud and screaming in the kennel in the next room, we want to make sure we have that in our notes because, or maybe a cart went by or somebody's spraying a hose down and they're spraying the yard down with a hose. Those things are all helpful because we can also determine if that is something that may be affecting what's going on in that assessment. So, right. So we want to go through maybe all of these different pieces to build that information. The goal being that we're establishing that baseline. The other reason that I think it's important and very helpful to do assessments for dogs that we have very little to no information about on intake is because we want to determine what type of support this animal might need as they're moving their way through the shelter. So getting a flat baseline, like I said, this is generally in most shelters at this point, is usually when I'm really doing like more structured handling, social behavior, etc. Because we can gain a lot of that data through observations and interactions. But what it's going to do is tell me if this dog is environmentally sensitive, if this dog does have handling sensitivities, if this dog is reactive to other dogs, is this dog barrier reactive? Is it, whatever the challenges may be, we're identifying those pretty early on within the first week of that dog's stay, ideally, so that we can sit down, or the management team can sit down or whoever's in charge of your shelter at figuring out what resources can we provide to this animal to help improve their quality of life. And also if there are things that we have noticed that come up that are maybe some orange or red flags in there, we can start putting a plan together to help that animal move through the shelter. And then, of course, if we're seeing some pretty severe red flags, we can loop in everybody in the shelter so that we can kind of be consistent with their handling. We can continue to ensure we're taking good observational notes, and we can maybe make sure that we have some extra eyes on it. And we are putting in reminders to check in with that animal and the animal's handlers more frequently. Because the more proactive that we can be about identifying behavior challenges, the more we can look at the resources we have in the shelter system and then pinpoint that dog into that direction. So, for example, if we have a young 8-month-old, super people social, super energetic, super dog social dog, but they have a really low threshold for getting frustrated. So we see a lot of leash pulling and barrier reactivity or pulling towards other dogs on the leash. That might be a dog that I would prioritize to go into play groups as often as possible, or buddy walks with other dogs, or play pairs. Or I might, if we don't have many dog options at that particular shelter, I might prioritize them for offsite outings with volunteers that are worthy, and worthy is the wrong word, that are trained in the way that they can handle maybe those dogs. I might put that dog on a higher priority for enrichment. I might change the enrichment for that particular dog. So, when we have enrichment programs and we're structuring them in a way that we can meet the needs of different types of our dog populations, for dogs who are young, adolescent, high energy, um, we might want to consider that they get some type of bully stick or a pig ear or a knuckle bone or something that they can actually chew on to relieve some of that frustration and stress. So we can I see that dog for who they are. Maybe if we don't have dogs, they get extra flirt pull sessions, right? So, we can look at who that dog is as an individual and pinpoint the resources in that direction, which is one of the things that I love to do, is kind of we take a look at what our resources are, and then we have maybe some tracks, right? So this dog is going to go on this track that adheres to high energy, low frustration, excitable dogs, and they get this type of track. And then a dog who's maybe fearful and shy, we have identified handling sense or environmental sensitivities. Maybe we say, okay, this dog ideally would be housed in a quieter section of the kennel or shelter. Maybe we work on having a handling protocol that includes some treat retreat, or maybe this dog gets high value treats hung outside their kennel each day, and they get food tossed in, and we can start building that confidence and the relationship building with people so they can feel more comfortable in their environment. Maybe we put a crate in that dog's kennel so they have a hiding location, right? So we're creating these tracks that are not necessarily based on outcome, but based on welfare for the dog in the shelter, which ideally, if that dog is feeling safer, comfortable, and having their needs met better, that will move them to adoption a lot faster, and we will see the deterioration of behavior from the longer lengths of stay slow down. So the goal is to meet the needs as much as we can, and then get that dog out as fast as we can, while maintaining that quality of life, right? And then we can also think about working with a medical team and looking at behavior meds for dogs who are really struggling, etc. So those are the two reasons we're really doing these assessments of these portions, is to identify um, who is this dog, establish a baseline, and then B, how can we help this dog through the shelter with the resources that we have available to us, which every shelter is going to be different and have different resources, but you have them. We just sometimes, I think, get so lost and busy in the day-to-day that we forget to stop and think about how we can kind of make those tracks for the dogs. And then the third reason, of course, is safety. If we have a dog who's come in and we don't really know who they are or anything about them, we usually want to put them through a series of these assessments to kind of just get that baseline and make sure that there aren't any significant behaviors that are going to be, really challenging. So, or safety concerns. So recently there was a dog at one of the shelters I've been working with, who at the very beginning was, anytime anybody went to leash him, we were seeing a lot of like agnostic puckering and like forward moving snapping. And so obviously that's a safety concern. And so we wanted to make sure that that dog was put on a track of limited handlers and decompression, and making sure that that dog had time to settle in a little bit. And then once the dog had settled a little bit, they were able to do some more assessments. But I'm going to get back to that dog later, because it's very interesting behavior in the shelter, and letting dogs decompress and then seeing behavior change. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And I'll explain that in a little bit. So yeah, so we're really taking this information for those three reasons. Now, if we have a dog who has come in and we have been able to get information from the previous owner, or maybe it's Actually, I'll pause on returns because that's something I can circle back on too. But if we have information from previous owners, the things that I find to be the most important, I know there's a lot of different intake forms out there, but I do think one that we tend to miss a lot in shelters is behavior towards other dogs. Like we might have one or two questions about, has your dog ever been in a fight with another dog, or has your dog ever bitten another dog? But some of the things that I would want to know as someone who would be going, as somebody who owns dogs and is going to look at dogs at the shelter and reading descriptions on the website or Pet Finder or whatever, the first thing that if I have a dog is I wonder what that dog's play style looks like. I don't care if it says okay with other dogs or fine with other dogs or likes other dogs. I would prefer to have a better idea before I commit my time to going all the way to the shelter and then having to ask questions and possibly do a dog intro. So what is very helpful when on your intake forms, if you're able to have more open-ended questions such as what is it, has your dog, let's see, where does your dog interact with other dogs? So maybe it's friends that bring dogs to the house, maybe they don't have any dog history, maybe the dog goes to the dog park, etc. You definitely want to ask about scuffles or altercations, and I definitely would change the verbiage from fight to something that says scuffles, altercations, or fight. So because we want to help people understand the variance of of different dog interactions, because I've had people say that their dog got into a fight with another dog, and in my head I'm picturing a brawl that had to be split up, but it was like a little tiff and a spat between the two, maybe tussled, no injuries, right? So getting some of asking some of those more open-ended questions. What does it look like when your dog sees another dog? That's a really good one. It allows people to elaborate a little bit. Well, when they see another dog off leash or on leash, they pull and bark, but they're fine off leash. They'll probably use language such as that. And then when you're in the interview, the intake session, you can say, well, what does fine look like to you? Can you describe what fine means, right? So you can then ask more in-depth questions when you're sitting there. But when you then go to do dog intros at your shelter or potentially bring them into a play group, you have a little bit of an idea of what that could possibly look like. I always err on the side of caution, obviously, but it's helpful to know, has a dog been to a daycare, has a dog been to a dog park, etc., because it can tell me a little bit more, and I'm going to feel less nervous about that dog. If it was 2 years ago and the dog was 5 months old at the dog park and they're now 3, you know, it's going to be different. But if it's been very recent history, that's very good information to know. And the reason that I find the dog stuff very important is because most people who are coming to look for a dog likely have another dog or have family that have dogs or live in a neighborhood with dogs. So the dog stuff, I think we kind of gloss over sometimes as a sheltering as a whole. I'm not saying you guys at your own individual shelters, but I do think it's something that is very important to people, and it's better to have more information if we can. So on those intake forms, asking those open-ended questions, and if your shelter is not sending forms out ahead of time, I also highly advocate for that. And the reason being is that many times when folks are coming in to surrender their dog, they're very emotional. They don't want to linger. It's really hard for them. And when we have to sit in a room and start asking them all of these questions, they're going to give us shorter answers. They might not give us the full picture. We might get some things that are true or not true in those moments. Whereas if we have folks filling stuff out ahead of time, we can sit down and look at the form. We can pinpoint the areas that are unclear to us, and then we can get clarifying information at that time. And then additionally, if there's contradicting information from when they filled out the form to when they're sitting in front of you, we can kind of sort through that in the moment. And I always advocate, obviously, for the most compassionate approach and to just hope that people are not lying. But what I have found is that most people feel the need to lie about aggressive behavior because they feel like the dog is going to be euthanized if there's a bite history, etc. So if you work on with your teams, just really working on helping them build rapport with people first instead of going in like clockwork. And, I know we all get into our routines and everything, but really taking the time to check in how the person is feeling, check in on all of those things to make sure that they're feeling as comfortable as they can in those appointments. I think that that's very helpful, and you're going to gather more information. I'll share a quick story just about where that compassion can be super helpful. So last year, this actually isn't necessarily shelter related, but because I'm in sheltering, it was good that I was this person. Somebody took the ferry across from upstate New York and dumped a dog over here in Vermont. And I saw the dog posted on like a Facebook group, local Facebook group, and I knew that it was clearly a dump dog because nobody this is a very small town I live in, and nobody had been looking for the dog. And so that told me right away it was probably somebody dumped it. And so my partner and I went out and spent about 2 hours convincing her to get in the car with us. And once I had her and contacted animal control to come pick her up to go to the holding area, unfortunately, we have two dogs and Moose is very particular. So we couldn't house her. We did put her in a crate in our mud room until animal control was able to come. But what I decided to do, and this is not going to work for everybody, but I took a picture of her and did a reverse image search on Google. And through that search, I actually found that she had been cross-posted in Upper New York from a humane society where the owner was looking to rehome the dog. And they obviously didn't take the dog in and just did a courtesy posting on their Facebook page. But on that Facebook page was the man's number. So I called him, and instead of and I gave the number to the animal control officer, who proceeded to call and berate him and threaten him, even though there's not much that we can do cross state anyway. I think he just wanted to make him feel badly. But I asked the animal control officer, can I try calling him back? So I call him back and I say, I'm not here to judge you. I just am interested to know about her because it seems to me you were looking to rehome her and maybe there was a challenge at the house and you weren't able to find a safe place for her to go. I'm going to bring her to a safe place, but I need to know as much about your dog as possible to help me. And so from there, he opened up, he said it wasn't him and he gave the dog to a friend or whatever. At that point, I'm not really interested in those details. I can make my own judgments on those, but my focus as a professional is to make him feel safe enough to give me that information. So he told me that, he had her as a puppy, she had no vaccinations, she had a sensitive stomach, and he feeds her sensitive diet food. And he also told me that they had a 7 and 9 year old in the house, or I'm sorry, no, a 6 and an 8. I don't know. They were like in between middle school and young. I don't have kids, so I should point that out. But young enough that they lived in a small house. I think it was a trailer, and that she was getting, I think she was about 7 months old, and she was starting to get nippy with the kids. And so he was having to try to keep them separated, and it was very challenging. And he was worried about his kid's safety. And he also was worried that she was going to then bite somebody. And so he needed the dog to get out of the house and gave him to the friend. Right. And so from there, I learned that, she was scared of the kids, those particular kids, right? I'm not going to look and say, hey, it's all kids, but you're thinking about adolescent dog. She was like a husky mix. We know that huskies in general can be a little sensitive to handling. They're very stoic breeds. They're high energy. We know that he was not in the best financial situation as well, because he couldn't afford to get the vaccinations and whatever. And in general, it just seems like it wasn't a safe situation. And I think personally, he brought the dog over to Vermont because he knows people in Vermont love dogs, and probably was like, somebody will help. Because the shelter that was closest to him was not able to take the dog in, and I think he ran out of options. That's my personal thought. I didn't ask him to award me on that theory, but what I did get was a lot of information. I asked him if she had ever met any dogs. He said he tried to introduce her to the neighbor dogs, and on the leash, she was like snapping at them, but they met on leash, like face to face. And that, yeah, I there was some more information he was able to give me, but when I brought her to the Humane Society here, I was able to give them all this information about her background, her history, etc. So, you know, the animal control officer was unable to get that information because, I don't think he understood how relevant knowing background history is. His job is to, control animals and all of that. But my job as the behavior person is to say, hey, listen, I just want what's best for your dog, right? And so anyway, that's a tangent, but I think it's really helpful to take that step back and really cool your calm, like calm your nerves down, forget about what has happened and ask and focus on the dog and that you're going to keep the dog safe and you're trying to do what's best for the dog. So, as much as that information, right? Because if we go back to the beginning where I was talking about, yes, we can do all these assessment pieces that will help us establish a baseline. If we already have information about the interactions with the children, so we know that children is probably going to be something we need to get more information about, right? So that's where we might do a assessment near kids, around kids, see if we can confirm, or I don't want to say we're like testing the dog on kids, but maybe we can go walk around somewhere where there's kids nearby and see if she alerts to it, if she gets hyper vigilant, right? We can kind of identify if it's all kids that are a challenge, or was that just like a home specific issue. With other dogs, we know that meeting on leash is really hard. We know that she probably hadn't met other dogs and then all of a sudden met dogs on leash. And so we can definitely do a dog introduction, but we're going to take it pretty slow, right? So all of that information is going to be really helpful. So when we need to go and assess these very specific pieces, we have the data to know how to do it in a way that sets the dog up for success and allows us to gather more information. So to kind of pull that all together, for the shelter, we need to have a holistic evaluation of who this dog is, but we've now got those pieces, and then we can go into specifically test those pieces. We don't need to sit through a standardized assessment and do A, B, C, D, and E. We just need to hit like C and E or whatever, So all right, so we're looking for the information. The other thing that's really important to consider that I've already mentioned briefly is that the context matters. So let's say, for example, we're doing a resource guarding assessment because we either had some sort of kennel or caretaker observation, or um, the maybe, yeah, I guess it would be more like, I mean, we are going to know if somebody says their dog resource guards in the home. I don't think we need to do much resource guard testing because we already know that it's there in the home, right? We just want to maybe talk to that person about the severity or what it was around or specifics about it, but we don't really need to redo a resource guarding test because that is where the ASPCA found a lot of false positives and negatives with that. But if we maybe want to do a resource guarding test because of some observation somebody had, maybe they're going to grab a food bowl out of the kennel and the dog like hunkered or something to that nature, then we can be careful and try to set up and see if we can restage that scenario and see if the behavior happens again. And why is that helpful? Because if it happens again, we have a good idea that that behavior is in that environment pretty sufficiently rehearsed, right? It's something that they're likely to do again. Sometimes a dog's having a fluke, like today they got cheese in their food, and so that became a higher level, something more to resource guard. Maybe they're not feeling well. But if you replicate the same scenario carefully, of course, then what we can do is say, okay, this looks like kind of a behavior that is rehearsed and they've done it before, they're likely to do it again. One example I would have is we had a dog that came in off a transport at one shelter and he was totally fine with all things, had not seen any sort of resource guarding at all initially. And then they went around and passed out bully sticks to each of the dogs, and he started resource guarding to everybody. in the kennel. Like he basically, and he couldn't see other dogs, but he was basically just hunkering over it and growling, and we could hear him growling from just walking into the kennel door. And so it was important to make sure that he was safe to handle and not to give him really high value food. But because the level of the guarding was so severe, because it was like he would quiet down and start chewing on it. And the second you open the kennel door, this is probably like 12 kennels, it's not like small. He immediately was like, "Argh!" And then he would get up on his door and hard stare and do like a lot of icky looking stuff. So I wanted to take him to a different space to see if that behavior could be replicated somewhere else, with a lower value item. So what I did is I took him to a yard. I back tied him with a long line, and he also had really light toys. So I took him out with toys. And when I was working with him, I gave him a toy and he was running around and he was like chewing it, and it was like throwing it around and stuff. And then he finally took it and then settled with it. And that's where you want to kind of wait until they get to that point where they're settled with it. It's like really theirs. And I took a step towards him and I said, "Hey, buddy, can I have that?" One step, just like with my hands open. "Hey, can I have that?" And he was probably about 10 feet from me. As soon as I took that step, he left the resource, charged at me, flashed his teeth. He stopped about a foot and a half away, I think, and then ran back to the toy and then chewed on it while staring at me. And I was like, okay, so that's a second location that this behavior is occurring with something that's different. So using that information, it's not context specific just to the kennel. It wasn't context specific just to, and I did this about 2 days after the first incident. So there was like a gap. It's not like I was like, "Oh, you're guarding the bully stick. Let's take you outside and poke it." Like, you want to give the dog some time. But it was really important for me to be able to do that. And get that information because now we know that that behavior was replicated in different areas. So, all right. So the last thing that I wanted to touch on is, when do you know
You should.
okay. How do you know when to reevaluate a dog's behavior after they've been in the shelter for a little bit? So I'm going to circle back to that dog that I was talking about at the very beginning. In which he came in and he was doing the agnostic puckering when staff was trying to leash him. And the reason that I say to circle back is, after being in the shelter for a few days, he started getting to know the staff very well. And okay, so after the few days of him settling into the shelter, he wasn't displaying that behavior anymore to the people that were handling him. So I had been working with the shelter and helping them with a few different dogs, and they asked me to go check him out, and they told me he's just like this really young spunky puppy, etc. And so I go to leash him, and as soon as he sees the leash in my hand, I got that behavior. It was the agnostic puckering. He's forward snapping at me. And I was like, "Whoa, okay, buddy, like let's go slow. Here's some treats, etc." But the more I kind of went to work with him, the more that behavior escalated. And so I recognized, obviously, that this is like a fear-based behavior, and he doesn't know me. But everybody that was at the shelter was like, "Oh yeah, he did that, but he settled in, he's doing really well, etc." But clearly, when there's a new novel person, he needs time to build that relationship. And so he had already been put up for adoption, and which is fine. I think that the faster we get dogs for adoption, especially ones that might have some challenges, that behavior is likely not going to get better in the shelter. But they didn't know that that was a behavior he was going to continue doing until somebody new had handled him. They had him listed as like a higher volunteer handling color, so he wasn't getting a ton of people handling him. And that's what can happen sometimes, is the people who handle these dogs regularly, the dogs get used to them, they get used to the dog, there's more of a relationship, and we lose sight of some of these behaviors. With some dogs, they get better, and then we'd never see the behavior again because all of a sudden it's the environment that made them scared and stressed. But in this case, it was new people that make him scared and stressed, and also the environment. I'm not saying that doesn't have anything to do with it. So what's important is now we were able to put together a plan for him to meet new people, and we're going to start working on generalizing a very structured greeting routine for him. And we're going to start working with other handlers in the shelter and some of the leadership team members so that we can help him feel safer around people and start working on that plan. So if we, as we're documenting and taking in these interactions and we're making sure that we're aware of it and we're talking about it as a team, we can make these pivots to our plans to help the dogs feel safer, and help improve their behavior and find better ways to have them do some greetings. So the other times that I might think about reassessing a dog might be if a dog came in and was very underweight or neglected, and we needed to take our time, and they've been in the shelter for 3 months. We might want to run them through a series of tests just to compare to that initial baseline what has changed. So I often find dogs who come in underweight, severely neglected, etc., that have to go through a lot of medical stuff, clear up a bunch of things, get spayed and neutered, and it's like a longer trajectory. It's really good to kind of take a stopping point and reevaluate some of that dog's behavior, uh, just to check. If we're seeing like shining colors and the dog is doing great, that's fine. But if we kind of are starting to see some behavioral changes, that's a really good time to stop and say, hey, why don't we just run this dog through some behavior checks again, and see if there's anything that has changed since this dog came in, to kind of look at that original baseline and see where we're at today. And that can also be really helpful for updating adoption guidelines or ideal home, etc. So Alicia had asked a good question down here. When you get a red flag or something concerning, do you make the dog unavailable for adoption? And if so, for how long? I think that's a really good question. As with behavior always, it's like yes and no. Um, if it's a severe red flag, yes. I would like to make the dog unavailable, but I also want to circle back as quickly as possible because we know that it's really hard to do behavior modification and change behavior in a shelter because the environment is so challenging and the handling is not consistent no matter how much we try, so I'm gonna want to see exactly like what the behavior is. So this is usually when it's a safety risk, right? So maybe the dog bites a staff member or bites a volunteer or maybe gets into a fight that with injuries caused in like a play group or something. And so we want to put a stopping point there, but we want to have like kind of a triage meeting about it as soon as possible to come up with a plan of like what is the criteria to get this dog back up for adoption, and what is our adoption criteria just to our community and the safety. So I don't want to see that dog on a hold for a week. Like we're either going to make a decision to work on this, and then if there is maybe we'll put it on hold for a week with a deadline to say like, okay, for the next 5 days, we're going to do X, Y, Z, and we're going to look for that behavior improvement, or we're going to change the medication, etc. I would say, I guess there should be a recheck. So if a plan is put in place, there should be a recheck, but we shouldn't just put the dog on hold and then see how he does, if that makes sense. Rebecca, do you use an assessment template? And if so, I don't. Each shelter I go to, I make a different one because it really depends on what software system they're using. So if it's Shelter Love, I really like. I've built some custom ones in there. Um, and if there's Pet Point has different ones, and each shelter has something that's going to be more specific. So like in Vermont, a big thing is everybody has their dogs off leash here. So it's really ideal for us to know like how dogs do off leash together or if they get rushed by another dog, so that we do a lot of on leash tests just to see the dog's reaction. It doesn't mean necessarily anything bad. It's just giving us information for adopters. But the things that I like to look at, so that is a good question, is like how social is the dog with the people? Is the dog protective of their people? So, for example, we have a dog named Daniela who she she has some territorial behaviors going on that are very specific to in her kennel and when she rides in the car. And so with her people though, that she's very social with her people. So like these are good things to kind of know. So I look at sociability, I look at their handling sensitivities, how they walk on leash, can they get in and out of a car? For most adopters, we need to at least get them in the car to leave. And if they don't get in and out of the car, we need to let them know that they should crate the dog to get them in the car. One that's good if you live in a city is, can this dog walk up and down stairs? Because I've actually had two adoption returns because the dog was scared of stairs and the person lived on like a third story apartment. So if you're in an inner city, that's something to take a look at. The other thing, obviously, is dog to dog behavior to me is very important. I talked about that at the very beginning. And then resources. I think understanding how the dog exhibits behavior around resources is really helpful. We don't ever want to tell someone like they do resource guard or don't, but we can explain to them like, oh, we play in the yard with the dog and, they bring us the ball and they drop it in front of us. You want to just have information like that. And if you're seeing any of those like safety risk things, like I approached the dog and he hunkered and growled at me, obviously that type of stuff needs to be documented. And then each individual shelter needs to decide who their adopter pool is. If you can work on building associative like classical conditioning, where you can create a better response to somebody approaching by tossing higher value treats. Or you could do an operant behavior, which is you teach the dog to like back up and move away from the food bowl. It really depends on the resources you have at your shelter, but those are the things that I think when you're looking at putting together what your shelter's behavior evaluation should look like, or evaluation and each assessment, what you're assessing for is going to really depend quite a bit on your community and who you're adopting to. So I really do advocate for each shelter to kind of have an adoptability criteria and then work backwards from there to what we're looking for assessment wise. And I will share some stuff with you guys for sure. I do have a couple things, but I get worried to do anything that's too standardized, because I think every shelter that I've been to works and operates differently, and different parts of the country like need different things. Let's see. We've struggled with our dogs giving medical team difficulties, but ops staff have no problems understanding ops is the food source and playtime, while medical pokes and prods. We do happy pet visits to the tech room, but we are at odds about animal becoming adoptable if medical cannot treat them. Any thoughts or suggestions? Yes, if your medical team hasn't gone, oh God, I'm on 5% battery. I'm gonna do this. You guys. I don't even know where my charger is. That's who knows. Yes, so if your medical staff hasn't already been through the fear-free vets and the fear-free shelters course, that's definitely huge. I also think that training the veterinary teams to understand that some dogs are going to have challenges in that department. That basically like we can train on low stress handling and also defensive handling tactics. There's a lot of really cool tools out there. I find a lot of shelters don't invest enough into safety tools, which is actually why I'm kind of partnering with Humane Innovations a little bit, because he has a lot of really handling gloves, the muzzle movement muzzles, uh, squeeze cages that are like humane ones, just Y poles, so we can be safer when we're working with dogs in a medical environment. And then also teaching our medical team staff to work, I think, more, uh, you know, I'm trying to find the right words. Get more comfortable with handling dogs outside of the medical team environment. A really great way to do that is if your shelter does like if you have a trainer come in and run like group classes every week and then make it open for anybody to sign up to go. It's kind of like a fun, enriching thing to do for the dogs and for the staff. And it allows people to practice like working with dogs, learning to read body language and doing all of that outside of the stressful environments, So even like your intake staff who maybe only does intakes, getting them to go to like a dog class and practice handling different dogs is a really great way for them to learn body language, behavior, and behavioral variances. And so that's something I highly recommend. So yeah, the happy visits thing is hard. I don't, in a shelter environment, and depending on the dog, like my dog Moose, I've been trying to do happy visits for I think 8 years now, and he still hates going to the vet. So for those dogs who have very special handling needs or restraint needs, you want to come up with a protocol, and you might want to send somebody from the behavior team, or if you don't have a behavior team, like one of the handlers or maybe a supervisor for that specific dog, who might be able to do some low stress stuff. Or at least has a relationship so the dog feels a little bit safer. Oftentimes it's because if we have have a dog go straight to medical and the dog doesn't know anybody in there, and it smells funny and maybe there's cat smells, we have to be really careful and understand that we're setting them up for an environment that's very stressful. And so, of course, they're going to associate the staff. Another thing that they can do sometimes if there's an association with scrubs is they can throw on just a regular t-shirt. They can take the scrubs off. They can make sure that they don't have all their gear on them that makes them look like medical technicians. They can sometimes come to the dog's kennel to do stuff. You could go out to a yard to do that. So you can come up with a variety of different protocols. So again, that's where like the integrating the teamwork is very important. And when I work with shelters, I really try to strive that every dog is an individual and has different needs, but so are the people. And when we're all in our siloed departments and not collaborating together, that's where we run into a lot of different challenges. So the important pieces are communicating, coming up with plans, and then having rounds. If your shelter isn't doing rounds daily, maybe every other day or at least weekly, we're definitely going to be missing a lot of just natural communication that happens between the departments. And I really advocate for rounds and when we do rounds, we should be going together, not as like medical does them in the morning and the kennel manager does it in the afternoon, etc. I really advocate that 40 minutes, three people from three different departments to get together and you put eyes on every animal and talk about things right there. Because I think sometimes we get lost in our departments and I think it's very helpful. Now, of course, if you have a much bigger shelter, like let's say 5,000 plus animals a year, you may need to have um, designated leads that do those rounds if like the person of that department's really busy. So then you would just train those leads on the important things to talk about in rounds and set some ground rules about not talking over each other, collaborating on ideas, etc. I really like the way that the incident command system works because it's really clear on who handles what. But yeah, those are different things I talk about. So if you guys actually have more questions about any of this stuff, I just decided I was going to start doing like 1 hour, one-time consultations. And that's something I just put up on my website. You can book those right through there. And that is something where if you have questions about your specific team and you want to dive into some of those details, we can do a whole 60-minute Zoom where we can talk about all these things and come up with plans for your specific shelter. Let's see. All right, I'm gonna have to skedaddle, but I'll answer this last one. I've got 2% battery left. Okay. We've struggled with our dogs giving medical team difficulty. Oh, no, wait. Okay. That's the same one I just answered. Okay, great. So that's my answer for that is there's a lot of different ways to work with that. So, all right. I hope that this was helpful. I definitely think that there's so much to go into when we're talking about both assessments and evaluations. But what I hope that you get out of this is that you should go into why you're doing them to begin with. And I think adoptability criteria is important. I think collecting kennel observations and interactions is incredibly important. I think updating your intake forms to include open-ended questions, having folks fill those out ahead of time so you can get more information at the time of intake is all really, really helpful. So you can make not only outcome goals and risk assessments, but you're also identifying tracks that the animals can go through in your shelter that can set them up for success and help meet their needs while they're in your care. So I hope you guys all have a good Thursday. And I don't, I, I'm not going to be here next week or 2 weeks actually, because I'm going to Connecticut next week to visit a friend. And then the week after that, I'll be at APDT. So I'll see you all in like 3 weeks. And I hope you guys do well. And again, if you need anything, please feel free to reach out. I'll talk to you all later. Bye.